right, folks, supposed fight fans, maybe some real deal, legitimate fight fans, boxing aficionados, people who are in love with the sport of boxing, people who enjoy it, people who just generally try and watch it, want to see combatives go at it. Back again, once again, I'm in here. Of course, Joshua here. And the idea is to talk boxing history. You know, we used to get a bit of boxing on the majority of nights, whether that's Tuesday night fights, Wednesday night fights, Thursday night fights. We don't quite have that as much these days, though we do have some boxing that is going down. A lot of the streaming platforms, they allow for more and all that stuff. So to break up that time and to allow for boxing to still be able to seep to the masses, we're going to talk boxing history, at least on this channel. Not everybody's down with it, but we're certainly down with it. I'm also down with Flat Boxing, who's in the building, says, what up, 86? Appreciate you, Flat Boxing. Always being here, always down to talk boxing history, and you know your stuff, but man, gonna have to get you on here one of these days, you know, to talk boxing history, because like you, I'm a fan of the history, just trying to get that information out there, just trying to learn what I can, and just kind of trying to spread that in whatever possible format that I can. So Flat Boxing, salute to you. Shout out to Flat Boxing. Everyone give him a follow, as always. That's what we try to say. So appreciate you being here, Flat Boxing. And everyone in general for being here. If you read the title, then you know this is intended to be a boxing discussion on the great Black Prince Peter Jackson. That should be a familiar name for those who are fond of the history of boxing, especially as it relates to the heavyweight history. But it may be a bit further back than some typically go, because we're talking about a guy who came to prominence and did all of his work in the late 1800s. And generally, you have to really be a fan of the sport to go back that far, or at least beyond a fan of a sport, maybe a fanatic in some sense, as they call it. But generally, the heavyweight history is probably one of the most documented histories in the sport of boxing. Of course, it goes way back. We can even get back to the days of bare knuckle. You had guys that were boxing, some of them considered heavyweights or would be considered heavyweights during that time, but there are a number of others who were smaller than what you may think the average heavyweight is, and they were still able to apply the trade not only in the lower divisions, but in the heavyweight division as well. So the Black Prince Peter Jackson, he is one of those transcendent guys who, when you look at the annals of history, just thinking about it from a Marquess of Queensberry rule standpoint, certainly a boxer who made a name in the sport and put his stamp on the sport and was considered to be the greatest boxer in the world by many during his peak. As a matter of fact, there were those that considered him to be the greatest boxer ever while seeing him and witnessing him in his top form. And I think that speaks volumes. That's like the highest accolade you can essentially get when thinking about boxing, for some to consider you to be the best in your sport or the best ever in your sport. I mean, it really doesn't get any higher than that, to be honest with you. And the Black Prince, Peter Jackson, is a guy who got that type of billing, I would say. So the purpose of this episode is to talk about it, talk about him a little bit, talk about what he was able to do, and talk about what he wasn't able to do. And as a matter of fact, we can probably start with that, because this is a guy, as I mentioned, who came to prominence in the late 1800s. And when you take that into account, we all know that the first world heavyweight champion in boxing was John L. Sullivan. He's the first recognized world heavyweight champion. Now, if you look through the video section of 86 Boxing, as a matter of fact, the very last video that was posted, you will see that it's a video on John L. Sullivan. It's called John L. Sullivan in Black and White. Now, the purpose of that video was to highlight those individuals that John L. Sullivan did not fight, at least 4 of them specifically, where we kind of dive into the story and reasonings behind such, and some of the details surrounding when it was about to happen or it was supposed to happen. But it also touches on some others who were kind of outliers. Timing may have been an issue or situation where it wouldn't have actually happened. But that being said, it kind of touches on those pieces of the actual puzzle of one John L. Sullivan. And one of those guys was, of course, the Black Prince, Peter Jackson. Now, John L. Sullivan was able to do great things in the sport without a doubt and became a household name, the first real superstar in the sport of boxing. But what could have taken him to that next echelon in terms of that mention amongst these greats overall, you all know who they are or who they are in terms of the Muhammad Ali's, Joe Louis. You think about the Bob Fitzsimmons, even James J. Jeffries, James Corbett, I guess you can say in some sense. But the thing that would have taken Sullivan over the top in a major way would have been him taking on the likes of a Peter Jackson, and that would have been the biggest fight in the sport at that particular time. Unquestioned, without a doubt. You can look through some of the articles, you can look through some of the writings, you can look at what was reported firsthand from newspapers in varying parts of the country and around the world. The fight that the majority of boxing fans wanted to see was John L. Sullivan versus Peter Jackson. And there was a point when it could have happened. It should have happened. It could have happened. It didn't happen. But that being said, the fact that it didn't happen, that's a story that's all too familiar in the sport of boxing. And we've seen that on numerous occasions. Now, before we dive into the Black Prince himself, let's look at some of these comments. Appreciate everyone dropping in. Joseph Phoenix, hey, appreciate you, buddy. Hey, always enjoy seeing your comments. Great dialogue, great insight, great intellect. Salute to you, Joseph Phoenix. Appreciate you being here. I don't know if this is the first live you've been on. Maybe it is. But that being said, I definitely recognize the name and always enjoy when you comment. Joseph knows a lot of stuff right here. And that's what I appreciate about being here on the 86 Boxing channel. It's not just I, but there are so many who know a ton of stuff. And a lot of nuggets are shared in the comments. That's why I say, folks, hey, take a look at those comments. Drop a like, but take a look at the comments, and you'll see nuggets that are dropped and passed on that are far beyond what I provide. These are some other things, because boxing, it has such a deep history. It's hard to stay on top of every single thing. But I appreciate you, Joseph Phoenix, who says Peter Jackson, colored heavyweight champion, Australian heavyweight champion, British Empire heavyweight champion, denied by John L. Sullivan a shot at the world heavyweight title. Without a doubt, Joseph, without a doubt, it's crazy. And Peter Jackson, he cleaned up the heavyweight division for the most part, and the only person left to fight was actually John L. Sullivan. And we didn't get that fight, but he pretty much cleaned up the division. I mean, what more can you ask for, actually? Appreciate that, Joseph. That's real talk right there. Salute to Rodolfo Rivera Jr. says, sup, y'all? Appreciate you, Rodolfo, without a doubt. I've been saying it, Rodolfo. I always appreciate you coming in, having a dialogue, representing California. Love it. Thanks, Rodolfo, for dropping in. Random Acoustic Thought says, big up 86. Appreciate you, Random. Man, we got to get back on here for a part 2 on the great Sam Langford. So I'll be hitting you up. I'm looking forward to that without a doubt. Facebook user, okay, son, I see you, say it loud. Hey, thanks, Ma. Thanks to my mother out there. She even represents, jumps in the mix right there. Appreciate it without a doubt. And shout out to my man, Boz, who says, hey, guys, Kylo Ren Boz. Appreciate you. Boz says he's hand waving. It doesn't translate in StreamYard, I guess, but says just dropping by. Really can't stay. Sorry. Hey, it's all good, Boz. Hey, we'll be in the mix on Sunday. Flat Boxing sends this salute. Everyone, of course, we all appreciate it. Good stuff, without a doubt. Good stuff, without a doubt. But yeah, so we're here to talk about the Black Prince, Peter Jackson, one of the great heavyweights in boxing history. Now, he, of course, like John L. Sullivan and other boxers from that particular era, there's no footage. Now, we do have footage that dates back to the late 1800s. We have James J. Corbett, of course. We have Bob Fitzsimmons, etc. We have some decent fighters who spent time fighting in the 1800s, even if we actually got footage of them in the 1900s. But that being said, it's not Peter Jackson. Of course, it's not John L. Sullivan. We just missed them. Peter Jackson, it may have been possible at some point, of course, because of the fact that he did fight James J. Jeffries early in his career. That's another one. Started his career in the 1800s or late 1800s. Same with Jack Johnson. He started his career in the late 1800s. We have video of both of those guys. We have video of Gus Rulin, who was a contender from that time. I mean, we have video of so many boxers, so it's definitely appreciative because in other sports, that's not necessarily the case. There's only a slight bit of video of Jim Thorpe, literally seconds in some sense. And you just think about boxing, we do have footage that goes way back. And I think that is a good thing because boxing was the marquee sport at the time. It was the top dog sport, and that was the way you can generate the most money in sports for the most part because people clamored to it and loved it. So we don't have footage of Peter Jackson, and sometimes people feel indifferent about fighters they haven't seen. Same is the case with Harry Greb because people haven't seen him. So we do have footage of some opponents that say these fighters face. For instance, Sullivan did face Gentleman Jim Corbett. We do have footage of him. And in the case of Harry Greb, we have footage of a number of the fighters that he faced. But it just so happens we don't have footage of Harry Greb in his prime actually fighting in a contest. Same with Peter Jackson, same with John L. Sullivan. But that being said, what can't be taken away are the accomplishments that these fighters actually achieved. And I think that tells the story in a way that even if you don't have video, it can be comprehended, interpreted, and it can be viewed as a means for truly understanding how good or great a fighter was. Generally, if you saw a lot of coverage on them, then in all likelihood, that means they were highly regarded and they were held in a particular purview as far as the boxing media, fans alike, and those who were in or around the sport at that particular time. And this was the case with Peter Jackson, who we have, interestingly enough, given the polarizing times with him being a black fighter, a lot of information on. There's a lot of coverage that was documented as far as him and some of the contests he participated in. We actually get direct quotes from him in newspapers, things of that nature. You name it, the full gamut. And that goes to show that he was held in high regards and he was someone that fans did want to see. And it was reported that fans were amazed by his overall abilities when seeing him in action. And I think the reason behind that is because he is really one of those guys who was sort of a trendsetter. He was a very scientific boxer who possessed a lot of the skill that we see in the great boxers, if you think about it. And I will always say, I will always present to anyone I can present it to that there is, I feel, in some regards, a misconception as far as the boxers of the past, like those guys in the 1800s and such. There's a misconception where some think that they weren't skilled or they didn't possess the abilities of fighters who came somewhat later, right? Someone in the 1920s or 30s or 40s, etc., where we are now. But I do think that is a misconception because there were very skilled boxers who were competing back in the 1800s, even in the early 1800s. When you think about the bare knuckle fighters, there were some that were touted for their abilities in this, what we consider scientific style of boxing. And we were mentioning it on a previous stream, yesterday's stream, Daniel Mendoza being one of those guys. So Peter Jackson, he is also one of those guys who was a big, explosive heavyweight who possessed those types of skills that were translatable regardless of what era he fought in. Real quick, Joseph Phoenix drops a comment, says, "Thank you, sir. I'm a longtime boxing fan and amateur historian. I've been blessed to learn a lot from the Ring magazine editor, Herbert G. Solid Goldman. Good stuff. There it is. Salute to Joseph Phoenix. Everyone give him a follow right there. Joseph Phoenix. Hey, I can tell, Joseph. Hey, I read the comments. I read every comment for the most part. And I try to reply to every single comment. And I pretty much have to the majority of them, I would say. I'm in that 90 percentile for sure. I have to be. And I appreciate your contributions, Joseph. As I mentioned, folks, definitely check out the comments on pretty much any video. You will see some boxing aficionados down there dropping gems beyond the videos, other things. Of course, even in the videos that I do, I don't necessarily capture every single thing. It's hard to sum up a single career, especially some of the older videos that I had where they were a bit shorter, but it's hard to sum up the career of a fighter, especially fighters during those times where they fought more often in a single video. So I try to touch on all of those things, or sort of like the high profile stuff, some of the things that may have some type of uniqueness to them as it relates to their career and how that may compare to other careers or boxers that we know. But certainly in the comments, as I mentioned, and I'll continue to repeat, and this is the case, I think, with other YouTube channels where they cover boxing or any other sport, you have many in the comments who drop these gems, these nuggets that pertain to the history of said fighters or whoever the subject is. And I think that's a highlight piece of what makes this great. So it's very interactive. A lot of dialogue goes on, and I appreciate it wholeheartedly. Bob says, I'm listening, but can't contribute much. See you. Good stuff, Boz. Good stuff. We'll be back in the mix here soon. Of course, on Sundays, check us out, Boxing Chit Podcast. Be sure to drop by. We try to do what we do when we can. So salute to you, Boz. Joseph Phoenix, while Jack Johnson was in Australia in 1908 challenging Tommy Burns for world heavyweight title, he went to Toowong Cemetery to pay his respects at the grave of the Black Prince. Good stuff. Another gem dropped right there by Joseph Phoenix. Appreciate that, Joseph. I didn't know that. That's good stuff right there. Jack Johnson, everyone knows him, of course, being the first black world heavyweight champion. That being said, that tells you everything you need to know right there. Him paying his respect to the great Peter Jackson. And, hey, that's big time right there. Big time without a doubt. Black Boxing says another great who passed of tuberculosis. Indeed he was. So that's the thing about the Black Prince, Peter Jackson. His final fight, I think it was 1898 or 1899, one of the two. I may have it here actually, because I previously done a video on Peter Jackson. It's on the page. Now, this, like I said with some of the other ones that I have, this was one of the earlier videos that I did, so it has that computer voice talking. Now I just do them all with myself, and it was shorter, so it's only about 6 or 7 minutes. Now, the majority of the videos that I do, though, they're a bit longer, definitely over 10 minutes, more so in that 20-minute range. But there is a video I have on him, and it kind of speaks to his career, really just the high-profile fights. It doesn't dive into a ton of background and all of that stuff. Warrants an update. A lot of those videos warrant an update, but certainly it's one worth checking out. So yeah, it was March 22nd, 1898, when he faced James J. Jeffries at 37 years of age. I hope I got that right in that video, because sometimes you can take stuff down wrong, but he did face the great James J. Jeffries, and that was his final fight. And it did not go well, of course. I think he might have been battling tuberculosis at that time. It's hard to say, but it seems like it was one of those diseases that could pop up and become dormant maybe, or whatever it may be, because there were a number of boxers that died from it, and some had multiple bouts with it. I don't know if that was the case with Peter Jackson. I know for sure it was the case with Nonpareil Jack Dempsey, who was a subject of a video that we did yesterday with Nonpareil Jack Dempsey. He had multiple bouts of tuberculosis. I think it kind of just hangs around and lingers in the system. It's pretty crazy, But Peter Jackson, another one of those guys. When he fought James J. Jeffries, another great heavyweight, one of the great heavyweights in boxing history, he was pretty much a shell of himself. So it didn't quite go well. He was ultimately knocked out. Then I believe it was like a year later, he ultimately died due to tuberculosis. And yeah, that was a disease. Of course, now we have measures for preventing it, or at least, uh, we do have a vaccine for it at this particular point, as far as I understand. But back then, of course, it was fairly new, and there are a lot of people who suffered from it. I was mentioning it in the last broadcast. There were a lot of boxers who actually passed away from tuberculosis. And I imagine, of course, just regular people, other stars of other sports, I'm sure they actually went through it as well. But certainly a number of top level boxers from that particular time, we can think of Black Prince Peter Jackson being one of them. Of course, Nonpareil Jack Dempsey, Joe Gans, Jim Driscoll, George Godfrey, you name it. I actually have the kind of inner shelling, I guess you can say, draft of a video that kind of just speaks on those boxers, or at least some of them. I tried to do my like top videos when I do like a top number or whatever. I try to make it 6 or 8 to go with the 86 boxing theme. Yeah, it could be. Yeah, it could be adjusted, of course. But yeah, I had started a video to just speak on some of these great boxers who ultimately died of tuberculosis. Some of them, of course, in the midst of their career, which essentially was Jackson, though he was older. Of course, Nonpareil Jack Dempsey, he was 32 years old. So, I mean, he was still technically, from all accounts, still in his prime when he was dealing with tuberculosis. So that's pretty tough right there, thinking about that. So him, Joe Gans, it was a little bit later in Joe Gans's career, but that being said, he likely would have still been active, but tuberculosis took him out. So it's one of those things that was no joke at that time. Yeah, Joseph Phoenix, as he mentions, TB also took out the immortal Joe Gans, first Black American world lightweight champ. Indeed, that is the case. First Black American world lightweight champ, and actually, I think I'm getting this right. He's the first African American champion, period, in the sport of boxing. That is Joe Gans. Joe Gans. So when he won that title, that was the case. Of course, boxing. There's so much boxing that I've looked at and dove into. I believe he might have beat Frank Aaron to win it. Frank Aaron, who's from, I believe he was from Norway. I could be wrong, or Switzerland, one of the two, something like that. But yeah, that is the case. Joe Gans, the first Black American world lightweight champion. I believe the first Black, or at least African American world champion. Period. Of course, the first Black world champion, from what I recall, kind of researching in any sport, was of course George Dixon, who was a Canadian boxer, one of the all-time greats, of course, of featherweight fame, in or around there, because those guys would fight guys who were bigger, all of that. The nine, of course, they would just go about their trade, when and wherever. It's just different times, for sure, different times. And they didn't have some of the same luxuries, of course, that we do see today. Interesting stuff, for sure. Now, Peter Jackson, he was born July 3rd, 1861, in Christiansted, Danish West Indies, which is essentially, I guess, the Virgin Islands area. From what I've been able to gather, pretty much the Virgin Islands. He's most commonly associated with Australia. So that's where he probably spent the majority of his most formative years, when he was younger. And of course, that's that's the country he was representing as he was applying his trade as a boxer. So he was an Australian citizen, and Australia backed him. I said that in the video that I was mentioning a little bit earlier on, the video of him tying to John O'Sullivan, that Australia certainly backed him. Now, interestingly enough, Australia during this time, that was a hotbed for boxing, and especially heavyweight boxing. So a lot of the great heavyweights from the late 1800s, even going up into the 1900s, the early 1900s, I would say, a lot of the great heavyweights, they actually fought over in Australia. And of course, we mentioned Jack Johnson. He won the title in Australia against Tommy Burns, a Canadian fighter who gave him that shot. So Australia was certainly a hotbed for boxing at that particular time. Of course, we know here today in modern times, it's still a place where a lot of good boxing goes down. They have a few guys who are some stars who've come out of there, George Kambosos, Tim Tszyu in terms of right now, who are boxing. Jeff Horn, not too long ago, made his rise. You have some other ones who are a little less prominent, by comparison, at least. Shanika Johnson, she just fought, as a matter of fact. So Australia, it's had boxing for a long time. They have Hall of Famers, a number of boxers that have come through, but of course, it's not quite the same as probably it was then, because they were hosting big time fights back then, for sure, in the heavyweight division. Their most prominent heavyweight, I guess, as of late was Lucas Brown, who was a decent guy or whatever. But back then, a lot of great guys or great competitors coming out of Australia, and a lot of the heavyweights fought there. So that's where Peter Jackson actually got his start. And it, much like a lot of those guys back then, you had to fight tough right from the beginning. So he started out, he took some losses. He definitely took some losses and all that stuff, because you start out tough there. One of his early opponents was Bill Farnan. He's a guy who doesn't get much mentioned these days. He actually didn't have a ton of actual boxing matches under the Marquess of Queensberry rules. I would imagine, I haven't done a video on him or anything, but I would imagine he probably had some stuff unreported, some mix-ups, probably bare knuckle, all of that stuff that he actually participated in. But Bill Farnan, he was a former Australian heavyweight champion. As a matter of fact, I believe he twice beat Peter Jackson. Now, this was a younger Peter Jackson. You could say he was still a bit green at the time. But Bill Farnan was the early guy to upset the apple cart. And it was viewed and kind of assumed at that particular point that Peter Jackson would be a guy who would go on to do some pretty good things in the sport of boxing. So I think that says a lot right there. And Bill Farnan was a guy who is unheralded really these days, as I mentioned, doesn't get mentioned as much, if at all, when you're talking about the great heavyweights or whatever. And I don't know if you can necessarily say he was a great heavyweight, but certainly someone who he had a significant piece of heavyweight history, at least his contributions as it relates to his work there in Australia, and having the Australian heavyweight championship at the time. I mean, that was as good as gold as far as boxing legitimacy is concerned. At least, I guess you could argue that as an opinion, but it was seemingly as good as gold because you had a lot of great boxers that were competing in Australia. So to hold that championship, that was big time. I mean, especially if you weren't going to get a shot at the World Heavyweight Championship, which a lot of guys, especially the black guys, didn't. But there were also other guys who, Farnan himself, for instance, the likelihood of him getting a shot at the World Heavyweight title, there were a few things that kind of would have thrown a wrench in that in terms of the bare knuckle piece of it. And also just in general, the distance and the champion's acceptance. Of course, during his run, he became a person who was considered someone who would have been a challenge for John L. Sullivan, but nothing serious seemingly ever materialized in that regard. Real quick, Flat Boxing says won the Australian Heavyweight Championship when he was 25.2. When he was 25, 2 years later, he became the World Colored Heavyweight Championship. Yeah, that's pretty insane right there. Flat Boxing, that speaks volumes of the great Peter Jackson. He was the man on a mission without a doubt. Had a few hurdles to jump over early, but that helped to build his resume and that helped to get him prepared for the road to come because he would take it with full strength. Joseph Phoenix says there's a link between Jack Johnson and Peter Jackson. One of Jack's first major fight was in Galveston, Texas. Shout out Galveston versus Joe Chowinski. Indeed, Joe Chowinski. Peter Jackson and Joe Chowinski had partnered up years before. Salute to Joe Chowinski. That's good stuff right there. That's good stuff right there. Good gems right there dropped by Joseph Phoenix. Check that out. They were fighting numerous exhibitions and training together. Chowinski passed a lot of knowledge training with Jack years later. Indeed. I was speaking with someone about this a bit earlier. Maybe it was in the comments. It was in the comments on one of the videos. But certainly, Joe Chewinski, he played a pretty integral part in the development of a lot of these guys. And Joe Chewinski certainly played a big part in Jack Johnson. He knocked out Jack Johnson, and ultimately, the two ended up going to jail together, and they spent, I want to say it was in the neighborhood of around 30, so somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 days, 30, 40 days, somewhere around there together. And they would be allowed to train, do a little bit of exhibition work, I believe, some of that type of stuff while they were there, of course, because while fighting was illegal in some places and all of that stuff, many people, of course, were still major fans of it. So this was just, an opportunity for them to kind of, we have these two boxers here, while Jack Johnson was still early in his career, there's still some prominence to him. And of course, Joe Chewinski, a guy I feel who goes underrated, one of the great boxers of that time, and a guy who I felt would have been the light heavyweight champion had the light heavyweight championship been established at the time that he was really coming up and doing his thing. So salute to Joe Chewinski, the California Terror. He's actually from San Francisco, California, same home of James J. Corbett. So Joe Chewinski, very skilled fighter. In San Francisco, they had pretty good programs out there for boxing during that time. So salute to Joe Chewinski. But yeah, that's big time being able to have the likes of Joe Chewinski to train with. And he was a guy, Chewinski, that is, as far as the times and everything, he pretty much fought anyone. So you look at his resume, top tier resume. He doesn't have that world championship, but that being said, resume aside, I mean, you name him, he would have gotten in there and fought them. Even if he didn't fight them, if he had the opportunity, I'm sure he would have fought them. Chewinski is just one of those guys. So that's big time Peter Jackson having the ability to work with Joe Chewinski. And if you look at these James J. Jeffries, Jack Johnson fight, there's some footage out there on that, of course. And you can see Joe Chewinski in some of that footage as he was working with the Jeffries camp, actually doing some sparring, some of that kind of mock sparring boxing work. And you can just see that he was a pretty skilled individual as it related to the boxing ring. His name doesn't get mentioned as much these days, but certainly one of those guys, when you think about the ones who never won a world title, he's up there high in the ranks right there. Salute to the Cali Terror for sure. Black Boxing says Jackson and Corbett had their fight stopped in the 61st round. Indeed. Both were known for their scientific style of fighting, and the fight was close, but Jackson was winning. Indeed. They got tired, and it was stopped. Yes, definitely. That's probably the most prominent fight on Jackson's resume, just thinking about the nature of the fight. 61 rounds. Think about that, folks. 61 rounds. And that's with James J. Corbett. We know he was a world heavyweight champion, actually the second in history, the man to dethrone John L. Sullivan in 1892. So him and Peter Jackson actually fought, and the intent behind that particular fight was that the winner would take on John L. Sullivan. Ultimately, it ended up being a draw, and we didn't get Jackson versus Sullivan. We got Corbett versus Sullivan. But like Flat Boxing says, it was for those that were in attendance, media, fans, etc., the general consensus was that Peter Jackson got the better of Corbett. And hey, sometimes it's like that, just back then, especially, this wasn't the only draw. There were a number of draws. If you look at draws and how they relate to guys back then, if you look at a lot of the guys from those times, many of them had a number of draws on their record, and that was for varying circumstances. Some of it was situations that were explained here. Some of it was the ruling in the states or regulations. That's the way it had to be. Some of these were fights where, hey, you had to get a knockout to actually get the decision or even win the title in some cases, or maybe most cases. So it could have been varying things, but that's why you'll see a lot of draws on record. So all win, losses, and draws aren't created equal. So it could have been a case where you were pretty much dominating the guy. You didn't knock him out, and hey, it ended up being called a draw. So those are some of the nuances that are tied to just the sport in general. Very interesting stuff right there. But looking through the history and kind of recalling and looking at the details of what was captured, because a lot of the reporters, journalists, or whatever you want to call them from that time, they did a good job in detailing a number of these fights, and you can get a lot of play-by-play as well, or round-by-round discussions on these fights. So they did a good job of chronicling such. So it's just one of those things, sometimes the rules of the game change just the dynamic overall. So Joseph Phoenix says Peter Jackson had a fan in the great Frederick Douglass, followed Jackson's career via the newspaper sports section. That's big time right there. Salute to that ring-a-ding Frederick Douglass. We all know him, the great abolitionist, Frederick Douglass. That's big time right there. He's him following Peter Jackson. That speaks volumes right there. That speaks volumes. I had heard something about that to a certain degree. I had read something about that, as a matter of fact, Joseph. So good nugget right there. I think that's big time, and that speaks to the greatness of Peter Jackson. He wasn't just a fighter. He was considered the fighter of the time, without a doubt. Rodolfo Rivera Jr. says, back when the Bay Area was actually involved in boxing. Indeed, it was. Yeah, California had a lot of prominence in the sport. Peter Jackson, when he actually came to America on that quest to face John L. Sullivan, it was San Francisco is where he resided, essentially, and that's where he set up a saloon. That's where his fight camps or training grounds were. It was in San Francisco, so the Bay Area was, without a doubt, heavily involved in boxing at that particular time. And as mentioned, that's where Corbett came from. That's where Joe Chowinski came from, a number of other boxers, and they had a very good amateur program as well, because James J. Corbett, he didn't have a ton of fights in the pro ranks, but he started out in the amateurs, winning the championships in San Francisco. I know he won it once. He may have won it twice in terms of, I think it might have been at the heavyweight ranks. But that being said, even on the amateur side, it was highly regarded in San Francisco. So that played a big part in the overall boxing experience in the Bay Area at that particular time. So certainly big time back then, Rodolfo. Blake Gallimore, salute to you, Blake Gallimore. Appreciate you being here, buddy. Says Jackson also knocked out Patsy Carter, who had just fought to a draw with John L. Sullivan. Indeed, he did. That was a part of that cleanup. So Peter Jackson, when he came to America, it was on a single quest to face John L. Sullivan for the World Heavyweight Championship. And in the meantime, while he was waiting, when there was a lot of posturing, there was a lot of back and forth, telegrams saying it was going to happen, telegrams saying, oh, we need this amount of time. He was just cleaning up the division. I know that he had at least about 24 fights straight in the year I think it was 1891. I got to double check for sure, but I think it was 1891. I know he had that run at 24 fights straight where he was just knocking off guys left and right. I mean, this dude was big time. Without a doubt. I mean, I think that he was the heavyweight that would have set that standard in a major way had he got that opportunity. I do think he would have won that world heavyweight title because he was just 100% on his game at that particular time, especially thinking about it if it would have been like 1891 or 1892 when it was supposed to happen as well. But ultimately, it ended up being the Corbett fight. But that's a very good point right there, Blake Gallimore. Patsy Carter, he was a solid boxer from that particular time, and he did fight John L. Sullivan. That's one of the common opponents. Another common opponent being Jake Kilrain. At least actually Jackson was going to fight Jake Kilrain, but Kilrain, if I'm not mistaken, ultimately passed on it, did not have the contest. He would have been one, though. That would have been a person that Jackson beat. And that's me thinking here off top because I recently did something on him. But yeah, it was something of that nature right there. But Kilrain was expected to, at one point, fight Peter Jackson. Black Boxing says Corbett actually almost finished Jackson in the 25th round when he broke Jackson's rib. He fought from the 25th to the 61st with broken ribs. Tough man. Yeah, that's big time right there. Broken ribs. I mean, we know that takes guys out here these days, of course. And as a matter of fact, the fight probably wouldn't have been allowed to finish. So I think that speaks to the toughness. Not only did he have the finesse to his game, but he also had the grit. He had the poise. He had that toughness. He had that chin. He had that just overall wherewithal to be able to understand the implications and what it meant to take advantage of whatever opportunity came about, because opportunities certainly did not come about always. And he knew he was on a quest here for a specific mission, and World Heavyweight Championship status was something that was on his mind. Man, that's big time right there, Flat Boxing. Broken ribs from the 25th on, 61 rounds. Of course, you can't even fathom 61 rounds these days, let alone 25, but it's crazy. Flat Boxing, Corbett broke his hand around the same time he broke Jackson's rib. Yeah, I think that kind of goes hand in hand right there. No pun intended, but broken hand, broken ribs. You got to fight through. Yeah, all of these guys were gutsy back then. The way that they fought and the amount of rounds, the process in general, and a lot of times they were using small gloves. There could be times they were using skin-tight gloves. I don't remember the ounces as far as this fight, but there were sometimes it basically like almost bare knuckle. You have something covering your hand, but didn't necessarily mean you were protecting your hand. So that too played into the reason why some of them went a bit longer, because it was about actually ensuring that you were able to sustain yourself, and at least you needed your fist to make sure that you actually got through the contest. But it's the nature of the beast, a lot had to deal with it. Joseph Finis, Peter Jackson also defeated the great colored heavyweight champion George Godfrey of Canada. Yes, the great George Godfrey, coming from the bog in Canada, one of the slums in Canada at that particular time, same place where the great George Byers came from as well. And it was actually George Godfrey that taught George Byers a lot of the stuff that he ultimately utilized, some of the tricks or trades in the sport of boxing. Both of them becoming a colored champion. But yeah, George Godfrey being the colored world heavyweight champion. George Byers is actually colored middleweight and heavyweight world champion, which speaks volumes of him. He's a guy that doesn't get mentioned as much. But Old Chocolate George Godfrey made enough of a statement that the Leaperville Shadow George Godfrey, who came a little bit later, took on his namesake. But Old Chocolate George Godfrey, this was another guy that was intended to be an opponent of Sullivan at some point, though that fight never materialized. But that being said, they were going to fight at one point. I believe it was 1881, and they were stripped to their trousers, ready to go, but the police broke it up. So that would have been big time right there had that fight happened. So we didn't get to see it, but hey, it is what it is. But salute to Old Chocolate George Godfrey. So Peter Jackson, as a matter of fact, when Peter Jackson arrived to America, the second person he fought, he took what I consider a tune-up, a guy he stopped fairly quickly, and then he fought Peter Jackson and took the colored world heavyweight title. That speaks volumes right there. And in the midst of that run here in America, he ended up leaving and going to the UK. And when he was over there in the UK, he took the British heavyweight title, or the Commonwealth heavyweight title, by knocking out Jim Smith. This is another guy who played a big role in the sport back then, especially in the heavyweight division. He didn't have a ton of fights at or under Marcus of Queensberry rules, but he was a great bare knuckler. And this was a big, stocky, yoked up guy. If you look up pictures of Jim Smith, and that's Jim Jem, though I'm sure some probably spelled it Jim. But Jim Smith, this is a big guy, big, solidly built guy. He's like a bodybuilder type looking guy from that particular time. And Jim Smith, he actually, John L. Sullivan, or before John L. Sullivan and Jake Kilrain fought, it could have been Jim Smith had Jim Smith defeated Jake Kilrain when the two of them fought for what was considered the bare knuckle championship or world bare knuckle title or whatever. But Jake Kilrain was able to defeat Jim Smith. But Jim Smith, very, very good boxer or just fighter in general from that time, because he did spend a lot of time fighting bare knuckle, or at least that's where the majority of his fights actually took place. So yeah, that's big time stuff right there, without a doubt. Black boxing, he put a beating on George Godfrey. Indeed. Now, George Godfrey, he was a guy who really was more so a light heavyweight, similar capacity to Joe Chowinski, even though both of them fought at heavyweight. They were both really kind of just light heavyweights. But, at that particular time, I mean, you didn't have the division in between. In most cases, like we do now, we have cruiserweight and all that stuff. So you just had to, jump up there to heavyweight, and it didn't matter if you were 175 or not. If the other guy was 200 pounds, it is what it is. You're just going to have to battle it out. So many kudos to those guys during that time, because, they weren't afraid to jump up. It was just, like I said, the nature of the beast. Butcher of North Texas, that is. Salute to your Butcher. Appreciate you, buddy. He says 61 rounds, but we have better nutrition. LOL. Yeah, right. Just think about if those guys, were a lot of those guys, they weren't on these type of programmatic plans and diets and structured, systematic type of approaches to how they went about their nutrition and all that stuff like we do have today with the technology and such. A lot of these guys, they were just, down home, fighting is my trade. I got to do what I got to do. I know I got to stay in shape. I got to be ready. So I'm just going to prepare myself, and it big time for those guys back then, So just think about that. So, yeah, that's why it's hard to compare these guys from today. So, of course, if some of these guys were fighting today, they would apply by the laws and principles of what a lot of the guys who are fighting today go by. So it would certainly, be different. And I think you have to take that type of stuff into account. So before you discredit those guys from the past, just think about the conditions of their time, because it was very different than where we are today, where a lot of stuff is available, and they had to do what they had to do back then under different, more adverse circumstances, for sure. More adverse circumstances. That was just the nature of it and how it was. Flat Boxing says John L. Sullivan said he wouldn't fight Peter Jackson simply because he was black. That is the case. That is how he went about it. That is how he went about it. And if you look at the last video I posted, I mentioned it's John L. Sullivan in black and white. It goes into detail as far as the back and forth, the rivalry, I guess you can say, even though they ultimately didn't fight, between John L. Sullivan and Peter Jackson. And that seemed to be pretty much the only reason why the fighting itself didn't take place. And of course, there were some other fights that didn't take place with John L. Sullivan. Even some of those guys were guys who were not black, they were white or whatever. And these fights still didn't take place. So there were some fights that were missing from his record that would have been big time had they actually happened, But Peter Jackson, certainly the guy who would have been considered the biggest threat to John L. Sullivan at that particular time. And the fight didn't happen. And as we know, as Sullivan got closer to the 1890s, then he started to slack off a little bit, especially in the 1890 time frame, 1892 specifically. So pretty much he had to be whipped into shape to fight Jake Kilrain in 1889, because he was already on the slide then, I guess you can say, from a lot of his out of the ring escalades and everything, or escapades. So a lot of his out of the ring escapades during that particular time started to wear thin on him, but he was able to be whipped into shape in 1889. William Muldoon played a big part in that. Wild Bill Muldoon. He was a wrestler from the time. I think he was a Greco-Roman champion of some type, and boxing and wrestling had some type of connection going way back as far as training and preparation, especially thinking about the bare knuckle days, because there was a lot of clinching, grabbing, holding, and all that stuff involved in it. But that being said, he was whipped into shape, and he didn't fight from 1889 to when he actually fought James J. Corbett in 1892. So that speaks to it. So Jackson would have been a major threat because Jackson, hey, he took the sport serious in terms of, especially during that particular time, because he was on the rise and he was on a mission. Craig Beedman, hey, salute to you, Craig. Appreciate you being here, buddy. Craig Beedman, thanks for dropping by and dropping a comment. Salute to Craig Beedman, everyone. He says the great Peter Jackson's best wins were against the Irish champion Peter Marr, indeed, and Australian and Commonwealth champion Frank Slavin, who was also the Police Gazette World Heavyweight Champion. Indeed, he was. I mentioned that in that video on Sullivan. So, yeah, those are two great fighters. Peter Marr, I do mention that he was someone that could have potentially faced Sullivan, though this would have been somewhat early in Marr's career, but he had racked up a lot of wins and a lot of fights at that particular time. The Irish Giant, Peter Marr, very skilled fighter, and if you look through his resume, you'll see he was in the ring with a number of top-level competition, a number of the top guys during that era. And, yeah, Peter Jackson actually beat him when he was on his UK run. He actually finished up there before he came back to the U.S., and he was able to stop Peter Jackson, or Peter Marr, as a matter of fact. I believe it was 3 rounds, to come to think about it, 3 rounds. Frank Slavin, representing Australia, former Australian heavyweight champion. I told you the Australian championship held a lot of weight during those times, but Peter Jackson was able to beat him. And this was around the same time that Frank Slavin was actually trying to get a fight with John L. Sullivan. As a matter of fact, Frank Slavin was attempting to do so before this fight actually materialized, when Slavin and Peter Jackson actually fought. And I know if you check out the video, John L. Sullivan in black and white on the channel, it speaks to that, and how at one point when Slavin was negotiating, it was already known that he was going to face Peter Jackson, and he was trying to get a date solidified with Sullivan, who was saying that he needed a year to train, which maybe he did or whatever. And ultimately, that was kind of going against the fact that he had a fight coming up, he being Slavin. And then it ultimately turned into Sullivan saying that he would fight Slavin if he were to beat Peter Jackson. Of course, they would go on the fight. And as you know, in history, the two did not fight. And Slavin, he was a big punching heavyweight at the time. He was about 6'1", 6'1 and a half, somewhere around there. And he racked up a number of knockouts. He had 43 in his, I can't remember how many victories, but it was a pretty high percentage as far as in his victories, the amount of knockouts he had. He was the guy who was compared to being like Jack Dempsey in some sense, as far as what the comparison was, or at least a comparable type of fighter to him. But Frank Slavin, very good fighter out of Australia, had a pretty solid resume, impressive resume, as a matter of fact, and he would take on anyone for the most part. And he and Sullivan taking on each other, that would have been a very good fight. And don't get me wrong, I think that depending on the time, Sullivan would have beat Slavin, but I don't know for sure as far as in 1891 or 1890 or somewhere in that time frame. You just never know. And I don't know if that was the best version of Sullivan, of course. But that being said, Slavin was a worthy challenger for him, and he couldn't get the fight either. So that was one we missed. And yeah, but that's a great point right there, Craig. Thanks for actually sharing such. Black Boxing, he fought an exhibition with Bob Fitzsimmons. Fitzsimmons said that Peter Jackson was the greatest fighter ever. Yes, I've read that as well, Black Boxing. Yeah, that's big time. That's why I was saying that there were some who considered him the greatest fighter ever. And if you have the likes of Bob Fitzsimmons, a guy who could be named in that billing himself, who could be considered or given those type of accolades himself, I think that speaks volumes right there, because Bob Fitzsimmons, one of the greats in the history of boxing, period, bar none. First 3-division world champion, of course, being the middle light heavyweight and heavyweight world champion. We all know the accolades of the great Bob Fitzsimmons, who spent time in New Zealand, fought in Australia, those areas down there in and around the same spots where Peter Jackson would have been. So that tells you everything you need to know right there. So salute to the great Bob Fitzsimmons, one of my personal favorite fighters of all time. and what he was able to do, impressive, given his size and just what he was able to accomplish in the sport. Butcher of Texas, they just ate real food. That's all you need, without a doubt. Butcher of North Texas, salute to Butcher of North Texas, without a doubt. That's all you need right there. Black boxing, the fight between John L. Sullivan and Peter Jackson would have been massive. We know that when Peter Jackson entered the ring against Corbett, he was cheered. They didn't care about his skin color. Right. Right. Contrary to belief, that is actually the case right there, flag boxing. And if you look at a number of the newspaper reports from the time, now I didn't link everything. So when I do a video or whatever, I try to link varying newspaper accounts, sources, or whatever you want to call them, references that I go through. Of course, sometimes I don't link everything in there, but that being said, I try to link those that are relevant. And you can just see from the newspapers, even in that video that I posted, you can see from the time there were, regardless of skin color, race, creed, whatever it is, people wanted to see that fight happen. People just wanted to see the two guys they considered the two best heavyweights, and for the most part, the two best boxers in the world at the time. They just wanted to see them face off. So it was not just that they were considered the two best heavyweights. They were considered the two best boxers, period. And this was going to be the biggest fight in boxing at that particular time. And the money was there. The money was there. So it's not a money issue. If you look at the video that I had, that I have up, John L. Sullivan in black and white, you can see that money was not an issue as far as that Peter Jackson, John L. Sullivan fight being made. I don't know. I know that at one point, basically the equivalent of what would have been $1 million at that particular time was put up in order to get the two of them to fight, but it just didn't happen. Sullivan didn't want to make it happen. It would have been big time, yeah, and from all sides they wanted it to happen, which is a crazy thing. It's just one of those great fights. It's not the only one, of course. It's one of those great fights in history. So, they say history repeats itself. We've seen a number of great fights here in our time that didn't happen, or they took a long time to happen, and the fighters may not have necessarily been still in their prime or whatever, but, it's one of those things. So it was happening back then for sure. Good stuff right there, Flat. Butcher of North Texas says Peter Jackson was very skilled, very well liked by fans. Indeed, he was. Yeah, there are a number of fans who were in awe of him and thought he was, like I said, just the top boxer at that particular time, and gave him his just due. Realistically, fight fans just wanted to see the fights. That's no different than today. At the end of the day, we want to see the best face the best, right? I don't care where you come from. I don't care if you come from Australia, Antarctica. If you're the best boxer in the world, or considered the best boxer in your world or your division, then we want to see you take on the other guy that's considered the number 2, number 1, or whatever the heck. So, yeah, that's the way it was for those guys back then as well, guys and girls. So it's just one of those things. Dan says John L. Sullivan, after 500 fights and years of terrible alcoholism, was terrible, out of shape, and bloated at the time. This is when Corbett got the shot in 1892. No doubt about it. No doubt about it. He had a lot of baggage, I guess you can say, during that time for sure, Dan. So, yeah, I think that he was going to be beat. Certainly, I think Jackson would have beat him. Corbett was able to get the job done. He had a lot of baggage at that particular time. I would say, probably in the latter part of the 1880s up to the early 1890s. Yeah, he had a lot of baggage, a lot of extracurricular stuff going on that certainly didn't lend to him being able to preserve the latter part of his career, because I believe he was like 32 at the time, or somewhere around there, 32, 33-ish. And you would think he still had something left in him. And I know he did do exhibitions and all that stuff, but to think that his last fight was the fight against Gentleman Jim, some of that was due to his recklessness as far as how he was handling himself beyond the ropes. And I was saying this, I believe, yesterday. We would have likely gotten video of John L. Sullivan in action, because that's a big thing. And we do have video of Sullivan at an older age. but we would have gotten at least Sullivan not too long removed from his prime, but it certainly wouldn't have been prime Sullivan had he continued to handle his career and affairs appropriately during the 1890s. But he did not, and therefore we didn't get anything tied to him. And I was mentioning in the last one, and I'll mention it again, the video of James J. Corbett taking on Peter Courtney, the Thomas Edison video in the Black Maria, I think that's what he called it. But essentially, that was intended to be John L. Sullivan. That's who Thomas Edison, from what I've been able to gather in research, that's who Thomas Edison initially wanted to be the star of that video. And Sullivan didn't do it because he wanted more money, and Thomas Edison, I guess, pretty much didn't have it to offer, of course. But it would have been big time for Sullivan. Gentleman Jim took the opportunity, and of course, the rest is history. And it's just, hey, sometimes, man, you have these opportunities, they're right there, and they can slip right past you, unfortunately. And that's what happened with Sullivan in that case. Flat Boxing says in 1893 to 1894, he would box Joe Chewinski in exhibitions, and Corbett and Chewinski couldn't land clean punches on Jackson. Peter Jackson had some pretty impressive accounts of his talent and intelligence. Indeed, he did. Indeed, he did there, Flat Boxing. So, yes, that's other stuff. Like in the videos that I do, I usually don't account for the exhibition, but a lot of these fighters, they had exhibitions, a number of things that they would do outside of just their official fight schedule or fight record or whatever. So yeah, that speaks big time to it right there. And of course, there was mention that Corbett had said that he would give Peter Jackson a shot at the world heavyweight title. It never materialized, as we know. That would have been a good one as well, had it happened. But realistically, Corbett didn't really fight much as far as putting the title on the line, defending the title. As a matter of fact, I think his first defense was a loss of it, but so he had it there for a period of time, but really didn't do anything with it. And you kind of saw that happen with a number of the heavyweight champions during that particular period. But there was so much money coming in just from the stuff that you could do outside of the rings that were tied to the actual heavyweight championship that, it started to take over. It's just the nature of the way it was at that particular time. But yeah, big time right there. So Peter Jackson, yeah, he would go on to continue to, he had a great career, regardless of the fact that he didn't get to take on Sullivan. But that being said, man, that would have been a big time opportunity on his schedule right there if he would have gotten that shot with John L. Sullivan. But he's still regarded as one of the greats of all time, and certainly one of the great heavyweights of all time, and a premier boxer during his era. Now, Joseph Phoenix says John L., like a lot of athletic celebrities, made a good living in vaudeville. Yes, indeed, certainly. Yeah, that was the way it was for a lot of those guys. So John L. Sullivan, he spent a lot of time on the road. He was doing his own shows and all that stuff, starring in things. Honest Hearts and Willing Hands or something like that was one of these type of plays that he was tied to. But yeah, it was, big time for him. But yeah, wanted to come on and talk about that. I know some of the other lives have gone a good deal, but I wanted to talk a little bit about Peter Jackson. So I got to step away for a quick second, but in the meantime, I'm going to let this play and give me your thoughts for sure. I'll be back. Hey, sorry, folks. I'm back in the mix. I thought this thing would be playing actually, but it looks like it did not play. I don't know. To Yeah, just come on here and talk a little bit about the Black Prince Peter Jackson. Had to run to the head there real quick. But that being said, man, he still had a pretty marvelous career despite not getting that world heavyweight title shot, not getting that opportunity at John L. Sullivan. Of course, he was in with some of the other great heavyweights from that time: Frank Slavin, Peter Marr, George Godfrey, James J. Jeffries, in a losing effort. Uh, but yeah, the Sullivan fight, that was the fight that eluded him. But that being said, he was still able to cement his name and legacy in the game. If you actually look him up, especially in the pretense of finding newspaper articles or just articles or documented history on Peter Jackson, you will see that he was one of those guys who was covered a great deal, and he was held in high regards during this time, without a doubt. Another great black Australian boxer, Edward Starlight Rollins. He floored Fitzsimmons in a great fight, but Rollins broke his hand flooring Fitzsimmons, and Fitzsimmons won by TKO. Yeah, I know Rollins. I don't know a ton about him, but I know the name for sure right there. Dan, I know he was in with a lot of tough guys. I have seen his name pop up on the resume of a lot of great fighters, without a doubt. So that's big time right there, especially flooring the great Fitzsimmons. Bob Fitzsimmons, one of the greats in history, of course. Flat Boxing says there's a recreation film of a Fitzsimmons fight with another boxer playing Fitzsimmons. You know, I have seen that in one of those contests. I know they did a lot of those often. For sure, they did a lot of those often in terms of those recreations, trying to kind of show how a fight went or whatever fight went. It's pretty interesting for sure. I've seen some that involved, or at least one that involved, I believe, Young Corbett II taking on, I can't remember who he was taking on, but I know it involved Young Corbett II, which is pretty interesting. Flat Boxing says Sandy Ferguson, I think. Okay, cool. I haven't seen that one. Big Sandy Ferguson, another contending heavyweight from that time, big guy who, yeah, he was in with a lot of tough guys as well, for sure. He had a pretty solid resume from what I recall. Big Sandy Ferguson. I think he stood about 6'3", somewhere in that range. Pretty big dude. But yeah, he was a contender from the time at heavyweight. And you had a lot of guys who fought during that period as well who don't get that name recognition per se, but they were pretty solid. Al Kubiak, he's one of them German heavyweight. But Peter Jackson, he also took on a guy, Joe McAuliffe. He was another guy, the Mission Boy. He was able to knock him out in one of his earlier fights when he first came to America. So he was just stamping his name in the game here in America. And many wanted to see that fight with Sullivan. We ultimately didn't get it. At the end of the day, it's just one of those things where, boxing sometimes it just doesn't work out. Now, Peter Jackson, he ultimately died on January 13th, 1901 at 40 years of age. So that's when he died, actually, of tuberculosis. And, that was one of the great heavyweights of that period. That was him, passing on. I mean, tuberculosis took him out. But as I had stated, he was able to still do what he needed to do as far as cementing his name in the world of boxing. So big salute to Peter Jackson, as well as a lot of those great competitors, or all of those great competitors from that period, because boxing at that time had a lot of guys who were, just applying that trade in a major way. Ferocious guys who had tough schedules. They just had to go through a ton. And oftentimes they didn't get a shot at the world heavyweight title. Peter Jackson was one of those guys, but he certainly was not the only guy. And what I recommend for sure is checking out the video I was mentioning, which is that John L. Sullivan in black and white video that is on the channel. And you can even skip right to the part on Peter Jackson, and you'll get more detailed accounts of some of the proposed matchups between Peter Jackson and John L. Sullivan at the time, including the two having an official run-in with each other in person. It's almost hilarious, but they had an actual run-in in a saloon, and you'll find out about that in that John L. Sullivan in black and white video. I think that'll do a better job of telling you how it went down than I can do right now. So certainly check that out. Of course, on the channel, we do have a number of John L. Sullivan videos as well. How John L. Sullivan changed boxing, or learn how John L. Sullivan changed boxing. Check that video out. It's on the channel. If you haven't seen it, it's definitely one worthy of checking out. It kind of speaks to how or why Marcus of Queensberry rules became the premier rule set for boxing, and that is essentially what we know here to this day. So John L. Sullivan played an integral part in that. So that's worthy of checking out. Check out the Peter Jackson video that's on the channel as well. As mentioned, it doesn't dive into everything. It doesn't even dive into some of the stuff that we talked about here, but it gives you a general overview of some of the top level fighters that he faced, as well as some of his accomplishments in his career. Real quick, Dan says Jack Dempsey said Peter Jackson top 5 on any list of all time greatest any weight class. That's big time right there. That's big time coming from Dempsey. I don't know if you're saying the heavyweight Dempsey or nonpareil Jack Dempsey. I'm gonna assume it's heavyweight Dempsey, since nonpareil Jack Dempsey had passed on in 1892. So certainly, my dog even joined in here. Come barrel, but yeah, certainly good stuff right there, Dan. The Manasseh Mauler. Black boxing is a recreation of Fitzsimmons versus Jeffries. Pretty cool. Okay, I think I have seen that one right there, Black boxing. I think I have seen that one. That was, or at least a piece of that one in particular. I know those recreations, they were big time during that period. So yeah, as I was mentioning, but yeah, that was the way they kind of showed fans. So yeah, just think about that. We're lucky here today, from a technological standpoint. Yeah, we can get a fight instantly and kind of see it. Back then, yeah, you really just had to go by the accounts, and that's why the newspaper accounts, they did a great job of documenting and covering the sport. And I stand behind that. You see it. They were straight shooters. A lot of those journalists, they were just documenting it as it was, just giving you their unbiased opinions, and they were giving you their real deal accounts of the fight. So reading through a lot of that, or at least going through the history, trying to do research and such, it has allowed me to be able to witness some of that. Of course, not like anyone. Check out some of that stuff. It's definitely worthwhile right there. Again, the Black Prince, Peter Jackson, known to be Australia's heavyweight champion, one of the great fighters during the late 1800s, again, regarded as the top heavyweight during that period, bar none. Certainly someone worth knowing. You definitely need to know the name Peter Jackson when thinking about heavyweight boxing period, especially the origins and the time frames therein around John L. Sullivan's reign as well. And so, yeah, he made a name in the sport, did his thing. We just spent a little time talking about him. Of course, this isn't everything. Maybe we can do it again at some point. But this has been an episode just discussing him and his career in a little bit of detail, of course. There'll be more stuff to come. As mentioned, some of the older videos, I want to actually do an updated version with more detail, more information, more facts, at least from the accounts that we do have. And that may happen here at some point. Just thinking about some of those earlier videos on the likes of Peter Jackson himself, of course, Joe Chewinski, a number of those guys, Jack Dempsey, even the nonpareil version of Jack Dempsey, even the other Jack Dempsey, the Manasseh Mauler, but just so many guys from that time. Jimmy Wild, who I have high regards for, very good fighter right there, who man, went through a lot. Had an estimated 800 fights. So that just tells you how those guys were doing back then. Flag Boxing says the newspapers back in the late 1800s were on point. They would do a round-by-round analysis of a big fight. I love reading those. Indeed, Flag Boxing, yeah, those are big time. Check out Random Acoustic Thoughts. For those, he has a round-by-round of the Joe Gans versus Sam Langford contest that took place. I don't remember the year. I probably should know it at this point. But certainly, it's a round by round that was pretty detailed going into some of the specifics. It's great to actually read that stuff. I've read through it. I've actually recorded it as well. I've done an audio recording of it in a similar capacity to Random. So salute to Random. Check them out. Random Acoustic Thoughts. Check out the Boxing Librarian as well, which would be Hardline Boxing Talk. Check out Scrapbook Boxing. There are a number of others out there as well. Rummy's Corner. He's one of them. He does a lot of stuff. And it gets to more of the more modern heavyweights, I guess, by comparison. But certainly, if you're a fan of the 1800s stuff and early 1900s, check out Scrapbook Boxing and Boxing Librarian, Random Acoustic Thoughts. Get to hear about some of these guys who are doing their thing in or around there. It's just a rich time for boxing. You got to think that was the number one sport back then. And a lot of those guys, you know, they were doing this to feed their family. So they were giving it their all in by any means, you know, and you just had to continue to fight to get those, to keep those funds coming in. Dan says Peter Jackson and Frank Slavin hated each other and fought in taverns anytime they saw each other. Oh yeah, I bet. I know at one point Frank Slavin was claiming to be the world heavyweight or Australian heavyweight championship, and Peter Jackson, he had to fight him just to make sure. No, I never relinquished this. This is my title without a doubt. Flat Boxing said you sent me that video a while back. Definitely worth it. All right, yes, sir. Good stuff, Flat Boxing. That is good stuff without a doubt. So, man, yeah, this has been great. Certainly, I appreciate everyone dropping by. We're an hour and 18 in. You know, the last couple have been a bit longer, going 3 hours, more than a bit longer. So we're gonna end this one a little bit earlier. We'll try to keep it in that hour mark. Just thinking about it, just overall, I think that works a little bit better for everyone. Gives people a bit of time, and of course, me, I have to take a bathroom break or something like that in between. That just goes to show you it goes long. Dan says, great point, Flag. The writers did a great job, and we can bring them up on YouTube from the original newspaper articles. Without a doubt, they did a great job back then. A lot of good stuff out there. Certainly more to come for sure. So we'll see what's up. May do something tomorrow. May do a boxing history tomorrow. I have to think about the subject. I do know for sure on Monday, which is Juneteenth, given such, going to do one on Jack Johnson. And that's because, of course, Jack Johnson is from Galveston, Texas, and it just makes sense to be able to do it on Monday. So look forward to that one. A lot of us know the Jack Johnson history, but seemingly, looking at the comments, a lot of people don't know about pre-title Jack Johnson. So we'll probably spend a good deal of time there. Pre-world heavyweight title Jack Johnson. So some of you can stop disrespecting this man and his actual accolades in the sport. But we'll see, though. Hey, everyone has an opinion. Good stuff. I'm not mad at you. Salute to you, Flat Boxing. Appreciate you in here, brother. Same with you, Rodolfo Rivera Jr. We'll be in contact without a doubt. Rodolfo, that Jack Johnson live going to be good. Indeed, sir, it is. Indeed. And Dan, thank you as well as everyone else who dropped in. Craig, you name it. My mom was even in this. Joseph Phoenix, I hope to continue to see everyone in the comments, all that good stuff, because it is appreciated. So thank you all. We'll be back for more boxing history discussions. We get a lot of the other stuff on YouTube, but we're going to try to stick with the history because it's great stuff, great fighters from those times. More to come for sure. So